Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to enjoy this special gathering. A few housekeeping notes. We request that everybody turn off your phone. I have to take special note of that myself. I'm famous for leaving my phone on places. Tonight's presentation is being taped for future broadcast in the Agrarian Voices Distinguished Lecture Series. And also, there's going to be a question and answer session afterwards, and so please make use of the index cards and the pens and pencils to write down some notes for questions afterwards. My name is Michelle Guthrie. I'm the director of the archive in the Tanya Amix Berry Agrarian Library at the Berry Center. This evening's lecture is a joint presentation of the Berry Center's Agrarian Literary League and the Agrarian Voices Lecture Series, and has been made possible thanks to the generous support of Jenny Herod, Jeff Ricketts and Tony Perry, and Cindy and Scott Anderson. We are also generously supported by the Josephine Ardrey Foundation, a Lexington, Kentucky-based foundation, which supports the educational programming of Kentucky nonprofits in the areas of music, the arts, and literature. Since we just kicked off our 2023 Agrarian Literary League programming, I would like to give you a little bit of background for that program. Since its beginning in 2017, ALL has given away nearly 2,500 books to Henry County residents as part of our work to foster the preservation of local histories, strengthen pride and stewardship of place, and conserve our rural culture. If you have not already, you are welcome to pick a free copy of this year's Agrarian Literary League book, River of Earth by James Still. Each book comes with a reader's guide and a bookmark. For those of you watching online, you can visit berrycenterbookstore.com to purchase a copy. Sales of River of Earth through the bookstore at the Berry Center help make nights like this possible. And finally, I would like to welcome our speaker, author Georgia Green Stamper. A personal note, the first time Mrs. Stamper visited the Berry Center Archive and Library, I believe it was just after she had presented a lecture for the Kentucky Humanities Speakers Bureau in which she participates. She was lovely to meet and talk to, something you'll discover if you don't already know in just a few minutes. When I began to talk about the work of the Berry family, she pleasantly interrupted me. She said, "Oh, John Berry Sr., he was king in our household." And I kind of thought, well, my work here is finished. you know everything that I'm going to say. So, however, she went on to talk about the tobacco program he championed and how it helped in many rural areas, helped them attain, for instance, college educations, important improvements in their homes and farms, and it provided a welcome stability and promoted the general welfare in rural communities all over the Southeast, especially in Kentucky. Indeed, many credit the program as the reason there are 76,000 small farms in the state of Kentucky, focused as it was on providing a fair and reliable economy for farmers. Mrs. Stamper was also unique in that she came here understanding what many people who visit us don't know, that, as Wendell says, his father started the important work and that he and his brother just picked it up. And at the Berry Center, we've picked it up from them. Georgia Stamper is a seventh-generation Kentuckian who grew up on an Owen County, Kentucky tobacco farm that has been in her family for almost 2 centuries. The oral tradition of storytelling that thrived not only in her home but also throughout the rural Kentucky culture of her childhood lives on in Stamper's writing. She is the author of 3 creative nonfiction books, which were jury selected for inclusion in the reading series New Books by Great Kentucky Writers at Lexington's Carnegie Center. She's a graduate of Transylvania University and lives in Lexington, Kentucky. Georgia Green Stamper was named to PEN America's 2023 Literary Awards long list for the Art of the Essay Award for her book, Small Acreages, New and Collected Essays. There are copies of Small Acreages available here this evening, and I hope you will consider picking up a copy. A limited number of signed copies will also be available through our website, berrycenterbookstore.com. Please join me in welcoming Georgia Green Stamper.
Well, the evening is a success. I managed to walk up here without turning over the sound system, something I have been known to do in the past. Thank you so very much, Michelle, for that lovely introduction. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to add my small voice to the Berry Center's chorus. The work that you're doing here is so very important to my region of the world. The work you're doing for the agricultural economy, to stimulate a vibrant social and cultural community here, to encourage our literary voices. For all of that, I just thank you on behalf of my people. I also want to thank my husband, Ernie, tonight. I want to thank a lot of people, actually. We'll wait on that just a moment, Ernie. I'll just thank you later, okay? Come on now, we're really old. We're really old. I especially want to thank Mr. Wendell Berry. I'm so honored that you're here tonight, Mr. Berry, and I appreciate so very much all of your gifts to Kentucky Letters. I've told many audiences that when I first discovered your novels, I felt like I'd gone to a family reunion in Owen County. It was the first time I had encountered my people and their language, their idioms, their world in literature. We have Appalachian writers, we have Western Kentucky writers. Yeah, thank you. And I especially thank you for allowing me to borrow the title for my book, Small Acreages, from one of your beautiful essays. Thank you for doing that. It was very generous of you to let me use that title. I also want to give a shout out to several other important people here who have convinced me over the years that my little stories were important. And I mention that because that's the theme of my talk tonight. I'm going to try and convince you that your stories are also important. But I want to introduce Virginia Underwood. Raise your hand, Virginia. She's my publisher with Shaylin House Modern Press, and the best first readers and editors. I'm going to call you editors because you're more than first readers. Letha Kendrick and Amy Piccirilli, both of you, if you'll just raise your hand. There wouldn't be this book, perhaps none of it would exist without your encouragement. So finally, I'm going to thank Ernie. We'll get back to him. I want to thank Ernie for putting together this little slideshow tonight. And I'm going to ask Ernie and Ben if they'll run it one more time, not because I'm so enamored of my pictures. They are my pictures, after all, of my farm and my relatives and so forth. But I want you to hear the voices. The Owen County Tobacco Heritage Commission was kind enough to let us use excerpts from the oral interviews that they recorded 5 to 6 years ago. It was a group of, I think, 4 volunteers. They had no experience in writing grants, but somehow they came up with a big idea, and they wrote a grant anyway, and they got it. And the result was the murals that you see on the barns scattered throughout Owen County that are pictured here in Ernie's slides. But they also recorded 35, maybe 40 hours of interviews with tobacco farmers whose ages range from 40-something to roughly 90. Actually, I almost considered not coming tonight. I thought maybe I could just send you an hour-long recording of these wonderful voices telling these wonderful stories. And because we had so much noise beforehand, I hadn't planned to do this. I was just going to let it run while people were coming in. But I don't think you were able to hear these voices, and I think they say better than anything else I'm going to be able to say tonight why the ordinary, extraordinary stories of our small acreages are important. So we'll run through this once.
Really started, as best I remember, in 1937 when my dad bought his first farm. And I remember well, and the farm didn't have a house on it. The house had burnt, and my dad gave $4,000 for a 94-acre farm, and he had to build a new house on it. Built a new house on it for $3,000, and the neighbors said, well, Mr. Davis will never be able to pay for it. Tobacco was selling for 5 cents a pound at that time. Well, the next year, the way I remember it, we got 50 cents a pound. Well, that made him where he could pay for the farm, you know.
It was the neatest time, you know.
It was always kind of a social event around our area. We would, my grandfather and his sons all farmed together. So they would all strip together, and all the wives and all the children would wind up in the stripping room at the same time. And every day people around the community would just stop in, visit for a few minutes, and then they would go on back to their stripping rooms or whatever chores they had to do. But it was almost a social event. Stripping tobacco was
one of those things that you don't forget.
Would you do it over again?
Yes, I would.
You would?
Yes, I would in a minute.
No regrets?
No regrets. Family.
Family.
Very family oriented. Enjoyed it quite a bit. Had some of the biggest meals. My sister would cook some of the biggest meals that ever was. My mother and I did, and my husband's mother, and my husband's sister. And we just had good times together. Everybody was.
That last would be the things you did in that stripping room and all the way up even to sale day. Everything that happened there was important to make the right presentation of that crop. And I said, a lot of those things that we did at that point didn't make the tobacco one bit better, but it made it look better. And when the first impression, when those graders and when those buyers came up, that first impression,
they haven't got enough time.
That was done in a real quick period when they decided what your year's work was worth.
They could tell a basket when you walked up to the basket before you took any pride in raising or stripping it and just about tell what kind of shape there was going to be in it to buy it. They bought enough of it that you had to, they know if you was a tobacco man or if you was one that just throwed it in there.
That's right. Back years ago, there would be lines of trucks with tarp down loads of tobacco, and they'd go out and paint a number on it. The floor manager or the floor manager, they'd have them lined up. There'd be a line through the warehouse over against the floor loading, and then probably a row over on the other side if the driveway was wide enough parked over there. And then a bunch of trucks parked outside that might be out there for 2 or 3 days before they even got in the warehouse to unload.
I long to hear you away, I'm bound away, across the wide Missouri.
Supposed to say like how long?
As I said, I borrowed the title of Small Acreages from this beautiful quotation from one of Mr. Wendell-Berry's essays in The Art of the Commonplace, the agrarian essays. I'm going to take a moment to read this to you. It may be that our marriages, kinships, friendships, neighborhoods, and all our forms and acts of homemaking are the rites by which we solemnize and enact our union with the universe. These are practical, proper, available to everybody, and they can provide for the safekeeping of the small acreages of the universe that have been entrusted to us. Entrusted to me, Georgia. And so I come tonight with a basket full of my own little stories, stories particular to my life, particular to my people, and to my particular place. Stories from my small acreages of the universe. Now, my husband, Ernie, you've seen here tonight, he grew up on the Kentucky River just down the road here, on a farm near Gratz in Owen County. I grew up on Eagle Creek at a crossroads called Natley on the other side of the county. And we are both, as Michelle pointed out, 7th generation Kentuckians, about every which way you shake the family tree. We're also 7th generation Owen Countyans. Ernie actually is the 7th generation in his male ascending line, the name of Stamper, to call Owen County home. But his maternal grandfather, Ernest Beverly, was born here in Henry County. In fact, most of Ernie's Beverly ancestors have roots in Owen County. And so it seemed appropriate to me tonight to begin by telling you a story about Ernest, also known as Pawpaw Beverly, because I believe that all our stories begin with the family story. I call this, I'd give $100. My daughter and I were 5 hours into a road trip with 2 bored grandchildren in the back seat. One of them is the little boy that was singing on this tape tonight. They'd exhausted the usual diversions and had sunk to the level of bug your sibling until it squeals. That's when I pulled out an old compact disc of Tom T. Hall's greatest hits that I keep in my car. I was first drawn to Hall's music out of curiosity because he was born and raised in the northeastern chunk of Kentucky that became my home in adulthood. I became a lifelong fan when I realized that he was a storytelling genius. The 13-year-old, however, began to gag. Inspired by her humor, the 9-year-old joined in with noises only a boy can make. I restrained myself from giving them my opinion of current pop music. Every new generation celebrates its own, I understand, but I didn't turn off Tom T. Hall. I wanted the children to hear the stories that he skillfully weaves into his songs. My favorite, The Year Clayton Delaney Died, is about a talented but broken small-town guitarist who inspired the storyteller's early musical efforts. Hall concludes the story with regret that Clayton Delaney didn't live to know that his protege became a success. That's the line, the one about the $100 that makes your grandfather cry, I told the half-listening children as Hall moved through the verses about Clayton Delaney. Cry? Why, they ask. Why? The story begins with their grandfather's grandfather, I tell them, a man named Ernest Beverly. Ernest, in turn, was the son of a Henry County tenant farmer named Jim Beverly, who never owned an acre of his own land. Jim raised tobacco on other men's hillsides all his life. In the cardboard photo of him that survives, he's good-looking and trim, with a shock of brown hair and kind eyes. They say he was a good worker, devoted to his family and the Methodist Church, but he had no chance to go further than his plow would take him. He could read and write, but like many poor men born in 19th century Kentucky, he had only 3 or so years of education. However, his oldest son, the quiet one called Ernest, would go to college. Owen County native John Wesley Hughes had founded both Asbury and Kingswood to educate needy students like Jim Beverly's son. Ernest, an eager student, heard Hughes speak at a local Methodist church here in Henry County, and he saw his chance. Encouraged by his grandmother, he left home around 1912 to enroll at Kingswood, 120 miles away. He went, despite his mother's objections to his uppity notions and her tears that begged him not to go, not to leave her. He wouldn't be able to afford to stay long enough to earn a degree, but his year and a half at college changed him, as education will do when it takes hold. He returned home a history lover, a person who pondered big ideas, a poor man who dared dream he could travel to the Holy Land. He also returned with a plan. He'd work the land as his father before him had done, but he'd own the farm, the best one he could find. Persistence and frugality, some might even say deprivation, defined his working life. Ledgers left behind account for his money to the single penny spent on candy for the baby, the dime he put in the collection plate at church. But over time, he accumulated enough dollars and enough credit to acquire a large parcel of land in the rich valley of the Kentucky River Basin. When he died at 82, he owned a beautiful, fertile farm that followed the river as far as his eye could see. He had no debts. He had savings in the small local bank at Gratz, where he served as a director on the board. A modest man who lived simply, he was generous to his family and his church. He never realized his dream of walking in the Holy Land, one he held on to until the final year or two of his life. But this son of a tenant farmer was no longer dirt poor. On one of my husband's last visits with his grandfather, they walked across the land, Papa Beverly pointing out improvements to the barn, that season's tobacco crop. When Papa tired, they stopped to rest on a little rise that gave them a view of the valley. They were still, listening to the sounds of the place, the birds, the cows, the humid hush of the river. Papa Ernest broke the quiet. I'd give $100 if my daddy could see my farm. The lyrics came round again, echoing the words that had fallen from Papa Ernest's heart so long ago. The children squirmed in the back seat, impatient with both my story and Hall's. I turned off the CD and gave them permission to return to their iPads. Someday, Tom T. might succeed in pulling him into his song, but not this afternoon. Someday, they might appreciate Ernest Beverly's story, too, and understand the magnitude of his accomplishment. Then again, maybe they won't. They're not the children of a tenant farmer born in the 19th century. With their 21st century ears, they may never hear his story clearly. It's hard to understand the past, though it trails behind us, shaping even our molecules, pulling us down or lifting us up. I stared at the horizon where the endless interstate met the sky and vanished from sight like the future I cannot see. What would the children comprehend of my life or their own grandfather's lives? Are we of theirs? Each generation celebrates its own music, I reminded myself as I slid Tom T. Hall's greatest hits back into the case. The stories we cherish, however, are always about more, I think, than a particular past. They've ever been the tool, from the ancient Greeks to Native American and African tribes to the Bible, used to teach and preserve a people's values and to strengthen the individual's sense of pride in who they are, their sense of belonging and identity. And so while I don't know if my grandchildren have read this story about Ernest Beverly, 2 of them are sitting here tonight, so I guess at least 2 of them have now heard it. We have 6. Even so, I don't know whether it communicated to Annalise and Georgia Jane what I hoped it would. Nevertheless, I've saved it, along with many others about who we were and what we valued. And those stories are there for them to find in the future, should they reach to understand. Understand. To that end, to understanding, our accounts of a specific place itself and the unique culture in which we've lived, like the stories that the tobacco farmers told us on the tapes, become time capsules that we leave for the future, preserving the details of our lives, even the idioms of our speech. I've written about the world I've known, the little 3-room country school over in Columbus with its outhouse and its cold, hungry stove squatted in the corner of the room. I've written about so many things I've seen over the changing decades in my lifetime. And of course, I've written about my memories of growing up on an Owen County tobacco farm. And Michelle's correct. I cannot come here. It was the first thing we talked about when I came earlier in the summer. I can't stand here in the Berry Center tonight without acknowledging the debt that my family owes John Berry Sr., who helped organize the farmers and led the early cooperative for so many years, such a long stretch of time during the last century, people like Ernest Beverly and my parents, my grandparents, achieved financial security and self-respect because they were able to earn a fair return for their labor off the land. And so I just simply want to say, I want to acknowledge here a personal thank you from my family to the Berry family for that gift to my people. It definitely, I'm sure, changed the course of my own personal life. With that, I'd like to read you a story. Tobacco Cooperative, of course, no longer exists. There are all sorts of complicated reasons for that, and I don't have the time, and I actually don't have the expertise to discuss the history of the tobacco cooperative or the pros and cons even of growing tobacco. We all have our own opinions on that. But it is different now. And so I'm going to read a tobacco kind of Christmas to you. For 100 years, maybe 200, my Owen County family relied on growing tobacco to sustain them economically. Of course, they didn't know how unhealthy smoking was for their bodies, but even understanding that as I do now, I am stunned that within a handful of years, 6 bent barns have come to stand empty. Fertile fields lie fallow. And the mammoth tobacco auction warehouses that once dominated towns like Carrollton, Cynthiana, and Lexington have become like dinosaurs, extinct overnight. My childhood memories of Christmas time intertwine with the tobacco market like conjoined twins, making it difficult for me to separate one from the other. The Sears Wish catalog would arrive the week before Thanksgiving, and I would sit then studying its colored pages in a corner of a tobacco stripping room while my parents worked 12-hour days to make my wishes come true. Preparing the tobacco for market was the next to final step in a process that had begun in early spring. The final step, of course, was selling the tobacco. We took our crop to Lexington, which claimed to be the largest burley tobacco market in the world. Gigantic auction warehouses came right up to the edge of busy thoroughfares like South Broadway and 4th Street, a visual statement of the economic impact tobacco held for Lexington businessmen, as well as the region's farmers. Now the old warehouses have been torn down or gentrified into loft apartments. Tobacco has become a villain, and few mourn the demise of the auction and government price support system that sustained it. The tobacco warehouses and auctions linger only in footnotes. The burley tobacco market opened in early December on a date calculated to be the coldest of the year. The cavernous buildings were walled with cheap sheets of tin that did little more than infuriate the wind, and a damp chill oozed up through the concrete floors. Despite the frigid temperatures, excitement electrified us when we heard the auctioneer's rapid-fire chant echo off the high rafters. He moved up and down the mile-long aisles stacked with dry brown tobacco, pausing only a few moments at each person's crop. We held our breath until he finally came to ours. A year's work hung in the balance of that single minute. Our hearts beat so loud we couldn't be sure of the agreed-on price as the auctioneer, speaking in his rapid, foreign-sounding language, moved on to sell another family's sweat and tears to the highest bidder. Only then could we rush forward to see the sale price the buyer had written on the tag. Only then could we leave the rank-smelling place. The odor of the dried tobacco leaves was so intense in those warehouses that it cannot be described in olfactory terms. It was something more than smell, a strident presence that seemed to take on three-dimensional shape like a beam holding up the roof. Or it could have been a living thing, an aggressive virus that invaded our nostrils, settling deep into our lungs. We ran from it as we left the warehouse and drank in the crisp outdoors to purge ourselves, as thirsty for clean, cold air as we had been for ice water in the August fields. Oh, euphoria welled within us as we drove downtown where the fine stores lined up along Main Street. We would spend freely for one time during the year on Christmas gifts and small luxuries, a new electric mix master for my mother, or maybe a transistor radio for me. We would eat at Walgreens drugstore. The all-you-could-eat fried fish basket was always my choice. Or at Purcell's department store's more genteel cafeteria with its fancy fruit salads. Years later, I would learn that the Woolworths I thought was so wonderful really was wonderful. A magnificent example of Art Deco architecture. I would learn that the Phoenix Hotel, with its canopy that stretched from door to street and its uniformed doorman and its thick carpeted lobby, was a pretty good version of a first-class hotel anywhere. Embry's vestibule, with its scent of expensive perfume, was as elegant as shops I'd later see in much larger cities. But the burly warehouses that dominated the city's streetscape were unique to Kentucky, even as the tobacco fields that defined the countryside were unique. Drafty temples of commerce, the warehouses anchored an economic system that was nigh on a religion, sustaining a tribe of people in the land they loved. Now Lexington's old warehouses are gone, and the fields on our Owen County farm no longer grow tobacco. Little girls don't sit and dream with the Sears wish book, watching their parents prepare the crop for market. A tobacco kind of Christmas lingers only in the memories of people like me. Oh, there's so many ways to save our stories. We can save them in scrapbooks with photographs. We can save them on genealogy sites. We can fill notebooks in longhand or write out typed pages that we take to Kinko's and have them copy into spiral-bound little books. We can make oral recordings. We can lean on commercial guides like StoryWorth's questions and prompts. The important thing, I believe, is to save our stories in some way for the people we want to hear them, people we may never meet, the stories of our families, our place, our lives. We don't all have to be magnificent storytellers like Mr. Barry. We don't even have to publish them in a book like I've done. We simply have to save them. Our stories are also witness to the defining events of our times, the moments when our personal experience intersects with significant communal and historic events. And as censorship looms on the horizon of the future, I believe that our personal stories and personal accounts have always been important all through history. Historians have relied on firsthand accounts of events that happened from ordinary people who went through them. But I think in the future they may become even more important. As for me, I begin to think I may have lived through too many defining historical moments. Some of them are still too raw for me to even write about. But I have written about the pandemic. I've written about 2020. That's something all of us have experienced, and our reactions to it were, in some way or another, I think, fairly similar. Whatever part of the country or world we found ourselves in, whatever our political views in, we could all agree that the pandemic was something we'd never seen the like of before. I retreated to the farm, to the land that has sustained my family for generations. I did it to survive. I like to think I helped my family survive by taking them back to the land. But I have to tell you just a little bit more about this story, going back to the land. In 1991, my father was killed in a tractor accident on the farm. I've written about that, but I can't read it too well without crying, so I didn't think I'd do that tonight. Mother wasn't able to stay on the farm. She'd been born there, actually. She wasn't able to stay on the farm alone, and so she moved fairly soon to an apartment in town. But she maintained the house until her death in 2006, from 91 to 2006, the end of 2006. She maintained the house as a second home. But after her death in 2006, I confess that I had difficulty spending much time there, where so many memories and emotions lingered around every corner of the house. I couldn't give it up. I didn't want anyone else to live there. Wouldn't be home, Mother said, if we rented it to somebody else to live there. I didn't give it up, but I confess that I was nonchalant. I gave it only minimal maintenance attention. From 2006, when my mother died, until 2020. So I'm going to close out this part of our time together by reading an excerpt from a story that I call Natalie, 2020. I saved the house, Mother, though I couldn't save much inside the house. Daddy's fine felt hats, the ones you had left in the closet, were eaten up by moths. I know why you kept them. You said seeing them hanging there kept him alive for you, like he'd only stepped out on the farm and would be back in an hour. You said that I wouldn't understand. I did understand. But the dust and the moth holes, I just couldn't save them any longer. I saved the house. Its bones, all the old wooden doors with their vintage doorknobs and all the original light fixtures. I even left Daddy's UK Wildcat calendars on the back of the closet door at your granddaughter's request, looking at you, Shannon. But I couldn't save the battered storm door on the front. I think you'd like the new security screen door that replaced it. I saved the house's kitchen cabinets and the magazine recipes you had taped to the back of the cabinet doors. I left them there. But I didn't save the mismatched dishes that you left behind in the kitchen for your occasional visits to the farmhouse. Your leaving them was a good idea when you moved to the apartment after Daddy died, but it's been 13 years now since you yourself passed on, and I can't put off any longer this last bit of cleaning out. We'll use paper and plastic when we picnic there. I did save an ornate lid from a missing soup tureen. I have no memory of it, so I'm guessing it was a treasure that Daddy picked up at one of the estate sales he liked to attend. I propped it in the living room bookcase beside Daddy's books. I think it looks pretty there. Oh, I did have to throw away a lot of his books that mildew and critters had damaged. Fortunately, though, the bugs didn't seem to relish munching on his beloved collection of Harvard classics. I cleaned them up, and they strut on as proudly as ever on your built-in bookshelves. I saved the house, but your custom-made avocado green draperies had dry rotted. I dumped them into 3 of those big black plastic garbage bags. After 40 years, I think we got our money's worth out of them, but I felt guilty tossing them. I remember how proud you were of them, what good care you took of your things. But I saved the house, Mother. I had a professional paint the outside, and the kids are helping me paint the inside. I've cleaned it crevice to crevice, because I know how you hated dirt, that cleanliness is next to godliness. Oh, but gee, bugs can find a lot of cracks to hide in and die in an old place. I saved the view of the valley from the house too, because that's why the house is there on the hill. The pastures are mowed, the barn painted, the fence is mended, and we built a deck off the back porch where we can sit and look out over the valley. I'm saving the stories too, but it's hard to get them to listen. I've told them how your father put the view together piece by piece, 20 or 50 acres at a time, as he had the money, as it came up for sale, and how it took him 1/4 of a century to do that, starting as a young man in 1908. How he hung on to it through the Great Depression that hit in 1929, when others were giving up and cattle and tobacco sold for less than it took to raise them. And when everything closed down during the COVID-19 pandemic, even the mall, I told the grandchildren about Roosevelt's bank holiday. How the banks closed shut in 1933 like the mall had done in 2020, and how my grandfather went to a man who had some cash money, how he talked to him for an entire day to convince that man to lend him the money so he could go to the courthouse steps and buy the last half of our valley view, the one that the Federal Land Bank had repossessed from a long-gone neighbor. I told them how it was the proudest accomplishment of my grandfather's life, how he had convinced the man to lend him that cash money at the bottom of the Great Depression on the strength of his word. Character collateral, he called it. I told them about our people, the Hudsons, who settled on this piece of earth in the 1830s, sturdy folk, survivors, and how some of us have been here on this piece of bottom land ever since. Then I told them to look beyond our wide valley to the yon side of Eagle Creek where a great forest stands. That's ours too, I told them, but it wasn't always. And so I told them about Aunt Suki, how in the beginning the land across the creek was hers, and how she'd shocked her small world by freeing her 17 slaves a good long while before the Civil War, and gave them all her land outright, and how it became known as Free Station. I told them that over there, the ancient boundaries of the land are still marked by dry stacked stone walls built by those black hands. I told them how it was sold off piece by piece over a century, and how my grandfather bought a big piece of Aunt Suki's old place in 1947 when it came up for sale, because he could, and because he could see it from here on the high hill where the house sits as he looked out across the bottoms, across Eagle Creek, to where the sky meets the earth. I saved the bones, the house, the view, the stories. It was quite a bit, but it wasn't much. I couldn't even save Daddy's hats, Mother. But this is what I did. When the COVID pandemic closed down America, when political hysterics wafted up from Washington like indecipherable smoke signals rising to the clouds, and I was afraid I might lose my mind in the awful newness of these times, I saved what I could of who we were, of who I am. For the children, I said, and maybe so, but mostly for me, to hear your voice again, and Daddy's too, wise, steady, laughing, guiding me through a maze that none of us have traveled before, that all of us have traveled before. I hear you whisper in reply, "There is nothing new under the sun," the preacher said. And so I saved the house. I saved what I could, perhaps even me. I hope that's enough, Mother, because I couldn't save Daddy's hats. I'm pushing the limits of my time allotment. I just want to leave you with the admonition to begin, if you have not, somehow, some way, your personal storytelling journey. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Stamper. That was so moving. It was wonderful. Thank you. We appreciate it. Okay. We have a few questions for you.
I hope they're not hard. We'll do our best.
Okay. You have lived in 3 very different parts of the Commonwealth. What has struck you the most about how the landscape has shaped the culture and economy of those places?
That's a pretty hard question, isn't it? Well, I think I've talked enough probably about how, the culture in which I grew up, the place here, the agrarian. When I say that Ernie and I are both 7th generation Kentuckians, let me emphasize we're 7th generation rural Kentuckians. We weren't born in Louisville, or nobody in our history was ever did anything very, flamboyant. So I'll talk first about Ashland, because Ashland definitely, we spent about 30 years in Ashland. We left the land. I'm actually, if Mr. Berry only knew how his words have haunted me and the memory of old Jack. He writes about old Jack's daughter, who moved off to Louisville and married a banker, and it's one of the few characters in Mr. Berry's novels that I've run across that he's not very sympathetic with. He's a little bit, I detect a note of criticism of Uncle Jack's daughter. And so maybe I was Uncle Jack's daughter. We left the land. My husband took a job with Ashland Oil right out of school, and and he was in computers, and that was new and fun. And we went to Ashland, and yes, Ashland was a place that actually was defined by its geography because it was on the Ohio River. So you had these great industrial plants that had grown up on the river. It was almost like a small version of Pittsburgh when we went there in the 70s. And at the same time, it was colliding here with Appalachia. And so much of the population of Ashland had very deep roots in Appalachia, which is somewhat different than rural Owen County. I had to learn, well, start with food. Who ever heard of an apple stack cake? Until I went to Ashland, we only had jam cake. That was the only respectable. I'm being silly, of course, but what I'm saying, everything from food customs to even the way we spoke, idioms, it was different in Appalachia, and Ashland, it was a collision. I did have the good fortune of coming to Ashland in what I might think of as the Renaissance of Appalachia. Would that be a good word? It was being, quote, discovered, and in the process of being discovered, its ways and its people were being appreciated, perhaps in a way they had not been for a generation or so prior to the 60s. So there was that. So you did have this clash of industry and Appalachian culture, but it worked. We all got along. The people who came to Ashland from Appalachia were happy to have good paying jobs on the train, with the railroad, and with the steel mill, and with the oil refinery, and so forth. Lexington is different. Lexington's always been one of the jewels in Kentucky's crown. It's always been a little bit, I won't say it's been better than the rest of us, but it's been a little snobbier than the rest of the state. It was an early center of course, the best land. My people didn't get here in 1770s. We were dragging here in the late 1780s. We didn't get that good land in the bluegrass. And so it had the best land. It had the universities, it had wealth, and we see that even today. There is a very vibrant arts and intellectual and literary community in Lexington that I think is quite special for a city its size.
Thank you. Can you talk about two values, the value of capturing stories in writing and the value of telling and retelling stories? Capturing stories in writing and then the value of telling and retelling the stories.
Well, the difference is that you have to find, in my opinion, some way to, obviously, telling and retelling our stories to our families is, in my opinion, very important. This is the way we pass on who we are to our children and teach them our values and all of those good sounding things that we've been talking about. But if we don't permanently preserve them some way, they go to the grave with us, because people pretty quickly, as much as I tell stories, I'll bet that even my daughters, much less my granddaughters here tonight, would have a hard time repeating the stories accurately. In fact, when I published the first book of stories, George Ann, sitting here, I'll never will forget this. I was very moved by what she said. She came to me and she thanked me because she said, "I was worried about how we were going to save the stories, Mother, but you've done it for us." Now, I hesitate to say that because then people leave and they think they've got to write a book. And that's not what I mean at all. I've told audiences many times about the letters I've found written by a distant cousin around 1915. She was about 85 at the time. And so her understanding of the oral history of our family stretched back almost to the Revolution. And she just sat down and wrote a bunch of letters to people. People used to write letters, you know. And she just wrote letters. And here we are, still reading Cousin Zerelda's letters over a century later. And she told us things like, not just who begat who, she told us what they looked like. She told us what their personalities were. In my case, my ancestor naturally didn't like to work as much as his brothers did. He became a lawyer and a preacher, so make of that what you will. A country lawyer and a country preacher. Did a little farming too. He was the first one on this land, by the way, but he inherited it from his wife's father. These details that we need to preserve them somehow. I love genealogy sites. I don't know if we have any genealogists in the audience, but I think they're a wonderful way to save some of our stories. It's an easy way to do it. You just write some notes up there about Uncle so-and-so. Uncle so-and-so did this, and he had a big laugh, and he was very kind to children and animals. I mean, you know, whatever you want to say about Uncle so-and-so, but if you put it down somewhere where it's not going to get lost, or has a good chance of not getting lost, it'll be there. I actually like these commercial things people are selling now, things like Storyworth. We went to a funeral here in Owen County. Told you Ernie has a lot of relatives here. And the son, when he was giving his mother's eulogy, he'd given her one of those Storyworth books, and he quoted from it. In the eulogy, it was so touching. We were hearing her words about different parts of her life in her eulogy. I think there are just so many different ways, but I do think we need to find a way to preserve them. This is why I think this oral history project that my friends in Owen County did is so important. I think it's equal to some of the work that was done during the WPA. I think it's amazing what they did with basically, well, just will. They were just determined to do it. They only had a handful of money, very small grants, but they did this, and now we have these stories of these people permanently recorded and archived in various places. They're online if you want to look it up and listen to hours of it yourself. At home, they're in the Kentucky State Library, the Historical Society. They're archived. They're there for whoever wants to find them. And already, just in 5 or 6 years, I think I noted this earlier, several of these voices we heard are of people who have since died. Mm-hmm. They're no longer with us. So, yeah, you got to get the stories preserved.
Thank you. You talk about your parents' hard work growing, harvesting, putting up, processing the tobacco crop. Who was there with your parents helping, and who were they out helping as well? Did they go to other farms?
Oh, sure. Well, they traded work, as we called it back then, with the Wright family, who owned the adjacent farm. And interestingly enough, the Wright family's grandson, I guess, Generation Wright, is now still farming our farm. He rents the pasture from me, and he has lots of beautiful cattle grazing on that farm and puts up the hay. And I could be doing more with the farm. I have a little guilt that I'm not, but I'm sort of a placeholder, and I'm old, so here I am. But anyway, the people that we traded work with for since the 1940s, we're still helping each other. I'm helping him by giving him a very good deal on renting this pasture, and he helps me by keeping it productive to a certain extent, and by keeping it from just going back to, a forest. So we helped each other. We also had what we call tenant farmers. In other parts of the country, they call them sharecroppers. It was not a word I ever heard used in Owen County. They were called tenant farmers. These were really, good, hardworking people, and they would live on the farm in a house that we provided for them, and they would split the profits from the tobacco crop, and most of them moved on after a few years to purchase their own farms, and it was sort of I wouldn't call it an apprentice program, but that was sort of the way it worked. Most people would start out being a tenant farmer, and then within a period of time, they were able to buy their own farms.
Thank you. In the archives, I have a lot of information about the early years of the Burley program, lots of pictures. And it seems like there was a great effort to get members in the co-op. Do you remember about your family participating in the cooperative program? Did they attend meetings? Did they vote? Picnics, events, newsletters? Do you remember Burley Co-op being involved in your life of your family?
Even though I'm old as Methuselah, you have to know, you have to understand that the Burley Cooperative was already law. It had been enacted legally sometime in the late 1940s, wasn't it? And so, in my memory, it just was. I feel quite sure that both my grandfather and my father, who were very progressive, yellow dog Democrats, worshipped FDR. I'm sure that they were supportive of the cooperative from its earliest days, but in my memory, it was already legally in place. There was no question, we just did it. My father actually, for a season or two, he did what they call measure tobacco. Back when we had an acreage as opposed to a poundage program, you had to go out and measure the fields. And one year, my father, to make some extra money, we were kind of tight that year, he went out measuring tobacco. In fact, this is a very personal story. When my mother lost her last baby, I had two siblings that were stillborn. When she lost the last baby, we couldn't get a hold of Daddy because he was out measuring tobacco. I don't think it would have made any difference. We got help as quickly as we could. I ran to the neighbors came. We did everything we could have, but that sticks in my memory. Daddy was out measuring tobacco, even as Mother was going through this trauma.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.